Welcome, Curt.
Well, John, how are you? John, can you hear me?
And I can hear you, Curt. You're all ready to go.
Terrific. Well, I appreciate your presence and those who have joined us. And it's great to be with all of you by Zoom this morning or afternoon or evening, depending upon what time zone you're in. We've all heard of Orioles magic, but when did it commence? And moreover, what does it mean? 1954, the Orioles arrived in Baltimore as the former St. Louis Browns defined Charm City, mostly a Colts football town. A quarter of a century later, 1979, Baltimore became a baseball town, which I'm glad to say it remains. Deserted by baseball in 1971, Washington, D.C. that year adopted the Orioles. Said O's announcer Tom Davis, the gas crisis also kept people at home, with baseball inexpensive, end quote. Moreover, the team took one late victory inning after another, one hero after another, based on work and fundamentals, what Cal Ripken termed the Oriole way. A new radio flagship began marketing Orioles magic. Song and promotion, heard in a bar, at a stoplight, on the beach, or all of the above. Retrieve with me then, if you would, Orioles broadcast magic before that year of 1979 and since. Let's start with a 1954 opening day parade in Baltimore. Charm City welcomes the woebegone Browns. In the radio TV booth, brought to you by National Brewing Company, are three men who would fuel Orioles interest from Pennsylvania to Maryland through Virginia and beyond. They were Bailey Goss, Howie Williams, and a former voice of the Dodgers and Giants, W. Ernest Ernie Harwell, who often said of a call third strike, the batter stood there like a house by the side of the road. Later, Ernie called that welcoming parade stirring, much more so than the rest of the year. The new kid on the block finished 54 and 100. Ernie focused on a beautiful 10-foot hedge at Memorial Stadium that linked left to right center field. Sadly, he said, the O's almost never reached it. With a bad club, you need the unusual. Harwell found it in 1957. Behind 4-3, the Birds' Dick Williams hit at 10:19 p.m., 1 minute before a local curfew law. All Chicago's Paula Palm had to do was eat the ball, and the game would end. Instead, he threw a game-tying homer. For the White Sox, the ball was not a tasty dessert. The O's won the replay. Before leaving for Detroit in 1960, Ernie Harwell won Baltimore. Said the great writer John Stedman, Ernie could talk and he could write. In 1955, composing the grand essay, A Game for All America. It began, It's America, this baseball, a reissued newsreel of boyhood dreams, dreams lost somewhere between boy and man. Baseball, Ernie said, was a ballet without music, drama without words. It was chagrin in being picked off base, humor holding its sides when an errant puppy eludes two groundskeepers and the fastest outfielders. It was nicknames like Zeke and Pie and Kiki and Dizzy and Daffy. A game for America, said Ernie Harwell, this baseball, then and now. That year was special to Baltimore for another reason. For in 1955, the most beloved broadcaster in its history arrived. Chuck Thompson came by baseball naturally, learning the game in his Massachusetts birthplace, near a home his grandmother rented. Among her tenants was Cornelius McGillicuddy, Connie Mack. Like Homer, Mack told baseball tales to the big league crazed youth who as a broadcaster later filled the air. To Brooks Robinson, Chuck Thompson was Baltimore. To Stedman, Chuck was as old shoe as a diner. Later, former O's John Miller then said it best, I don't care what Chuck says as long as Chuck says it. Thompson aired the vast majority of O's games through the year 2000. A favorite saying was, ain't the beer cold? Another stemmed from a man who lived nearby, an avid golfer but formal, who never swore on missing a putt. Chuck said, I'd hear him in the yard shouting a phrase I never understood. Intrigued, He borrowed Go to War, Miss Agnes. In 1957, a change in beer sponsors made him a senator's voice and brought to Baltimore Herb Carneal, who said, Ernie Harwell taught me his philosophy. Clarify, paint a picture. The radio listener doesn't know anything until you tell him. Carneal told of Hoyt Wilhelm's 1958 no-hitter. Here you see him just after tossing the no-no. Rocky Colavito's 4 homers in one 1959 game at Baltimore. That Carneal broadcast as well. Then 1960's near-miss Baby Birds. That year, Chuck Thompson keyed NBC Radio's broadcast of the Fall Classic. In Game 7, and this is one of the most magnificent baseball photos to me ever taken. In Game 7, after calling the Pirates' Bill Mazeroski's 9th inning homer to win the 1960 World Series, Chuck gave the score 10-0, not the real 10-9. Later, the Pirates asked if he wanted a voiceover correction on an LP record. Hey, he noted, I said it, so keep it in. The flack endeared him even more. Go to war, Miss Agnes. Well, the city might for Chuck. In late 1961, beer rights changed. Herb and Bob Murphy, each losing their job, but not till Bob etched Roger Maris's historic swing off Jack Fisher. It's number 60, he cried in WBAL Baltimore. He's tied the babe. 1962, Chuck came home. 1964, Frank Messer arrived, and Abel number 2. In 1966, Bill O'Donnell joined the Birds, where through 1982 he and Thompson forged a notable and ennobling pair. Never ever, said Chuck, did I hear Bill say a bad word about anyone. Never ever did I hear him utter one word of profanity. Such people are hard to find. Also hard to find better timing than O'Donnell's first year in Baltimore. The 66ers broke their attendance record, won a first pennant, and swept the series against the Dodgers. Thompson added a baseball title to match 1958's 1959's with the Colts. In 1969, the Orioles waved another flag. Back then, local team voices did the World Series. Think about this, given broadcasting's egomania. Chuck Thompson volunteered to let O'Donnell air 1969's on NBC TV. He said, I'd done a classic. I wanted to make sure Bill got one. The 1969 series, of course, left a lot to remember, though Baltimore would as soon forget. 1970 gave us the Brooks Robinson series. Ask the Reds about his Velcro mitt, or Chuck about what he called number 5's Golden Glove artistry. Brooks played a simple game, said Thompson. Hit it to him and he'd catch it. On grass, turf, concrete, in a swamp. Throw it to him and Brooks hit it. 2,848 hits. Above all, stories. Tales of how Earl Weaver's O's won 6 divisions, 4 flags, and 1 series. Numbers they don't tell how sublime the Orioles truly were. One day, Paul Blair led off third base. Swinging, Frank Robinson hurled a bat near the seats. Blair faced them, worried, said Chuck, about a fan injury. Whereupon, catcher Bill Freehand tagged him. You're out, said the umpire. You can't do that, said Blair. Why not, said the ump. Because, Paul said, when I get back to the dugout, Earl is going to kill me. Who could forget the O's bantamweight skipper? Unique, said Chuck, like his double-billed cap, so that he could argue any way he turned. One day, homering, outfielder turned minister Pat Kelly touched the plate, raised an arm, and pointed skyward. What's with this pointing, Earl asked. Kelly said, without the good Lord, I wouldn't be able to do that. Kel, said Earl, the good Lord didn't do much for the guy who threw the ball. In 1979, Chuck and Bill described a pennant in the year Orioles magic was born. Tom Maher helped as well, airing O's radio for 8 years, including 2 World Series locally. Wild Bill Hagee, lyrically, poetically contorted to spell O-R-I-O-L-E-S. In 1981, Eddie Murray led in AL homers and RBI. 1982, Cal Ripken Jr. debuted. The last weekend, the O's almost won the East, but lost the final game. The crowd, as many of you will recall, wouldn't leave, chanting "Earl, Earl" about the retiring manager. That fall, O'Donnell died of cancer. Without this dear man, said Thompson, I knew radio wouldn't be the same. He switched exclusively to TV. His analyst, Brooks Robinson. This left a radio void, which former Red Sox voice John Miller filled, hosting a 1983 opening day rally at Inner Harbor. 50,000 cheered. O-R-I, O-L-E-S. People asked, John said, how do Oriole fans compare to the Red Sox? I ask, how do Boston fans compare to the Orioles? John arrived to a sense of caring for the O's that Harwell, Thompson, and O'Donnell had helped to build. On cable's Home Team Sports, Mel Proctor now helped the new cable network's audience swell. TV cameras panned Memorial Stadium on seat cushion night. Beloved PA Mikeman Rex Barney, the picture shown is of his memoir of the Orioles, said, hold up your seat cushion. A voice who followed his own drummer, Home Team Sports' John Lowenstein, then proceeded to throw his cushion onto the field. The photo that you're looking at is of John after hitting a playoff game-winning homer in 1979, well coiffed as always. Like lemmings that seat cushion night, hundreds more followed onto the field, halting play till each cushion was removed. Play was stopped. Brother Lowe rebuked. I take baseball seriously, Proctor said, but I also learned, John taught me, that baseball is a game. If people sense you're having fun, they'll have fun watching. Imagine. The 1983 season ended with Miller saying, line drive, Ripken catches it at shortstop, and the Orioles are champions of the world. 6 years later, John signed a contract as play-by-play voice of ESPN's Sunday Night Baseball, winning a Cable Ace Award. He accepted at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel, saying, I am incredibly honored to win this award with this room full of talented people. What am I? I go to games and my best lines are low, ball one, or probably the line I'm most proud of, said Miller, line drive, foul. In 1991, the O's helped close their home. That October 4, Miller introduced Thompson. The ovation volleyed, rocked the girders of Memorial Stadium, shook the field. 2 days later, Ripken banged into a stadium-ending double play. The field was cleared. Music began from Field of Dreams. The first O's left the dugout. Brooks for third base, Frank Robbie for right field, here shown a decade earlier. Then came Jim Palmer pitching, said Chuck, booged to first. This is how the team said goodbye to Memorial Stadium. Ex-players coming back. The crowd hadn't expected this. When it happened, they were stunned. Any of you who maybe have been there that night, as I did, will never forget this. More than 75 players ran in period uniforms to their positions. No introduction, just music rolling. Chuck looked with binoculars at Brooks and Boog, and they were all fighting to keep from breaking down. Later, Thompson walked to his car through a sea of red-eyed love. Whoever says, he noted, there's no crying in baseball, would that day change his mind? And what you're looking at now is a pennant from that final weekend. In 1992, the O's opened their new home at Camden Yards, Chuck and John on play-by-play. It was hip, said Thompson, but it wasn't home. Cooperstown was. By 1993, inducted into its broadcast wing, he told listeners, someday, when someone asks if you knew Chuck Thompson, I hope you can say, yes, I did. He was a friend. He joined Harwell, Carneal, and Murphy, receiving the Ford C. Frick Award for Broadcast Excellence, and in 2010 by John Miller, who could mimic, and still does, Chuck, Harry Carey, and Vin Scully. Scully in English, Spanish, and Japanese. In September 1995, in the wake of a player's strike, Ripken, of course, passed Lou Gehrig's streak by playing in his 2,131st straight game. Usually, Miller would call the game for ESPN, but the voice also of the O's declined, calling this a national game, but a Baltimore thing. John opted for Birds Radio, then wore a tuxedo. hosting ceremonies on the field. Leaving the White House to share Cal's summit was President Bill Clinton, joined by Vice President Al Gore. You see the three of them are here. Fourth inning, Clinton goes on the air. The count on Cal goes to 3-0, and John Miller makes a funny. This night of all night, he said, he, referring to Angels pitcher Sean Bosky, can't be walking Cal, not in this game. Maybe you could send a presidential order down there, ordering him to throw Cal a strike. Clinton paused. I know one thing, the president said. Cal wants to hit this pitch, but if it's not a strike, he'll take the walk for the good of the team because that's the kind of guy he is. John Miller then said, that's very true. On the other hand, if he grooves one, even on 3-0, oh well, said Clinton, then Cal will hit it a long way. At that very moment, Cal swings and boom, home run. John starts calling it, but Clinton with his own microphone starts yelling, go, go, yes, ah, ah. The president's clapping his hands, shouting into the mic and helping to call the homer. So what does Miller do? What could he do? He couldn't grab Clinton's mic away, so John became background noise. The bad news, Miller continued, was that it kind of put me off because this was a major moment in baseball history. But the good news mattered more. He was the president of the United States, the first fan. He's reflecting the excitement of the night better than any broadcaster could. Plus, John added, I could now put on my resume, worked with President Bill Clinton, a very close friend. Here you see a Ripken wave from that extraordinarily memorable date. In 1997, a dispute led John to return home to his native San Francisco. In 2001, Home Team Sports yielded to the Comcast Sportsnet Mid-Atlantic Network as the O's TV carrier. Michael Bregai began play-by-play. You see him here. Yielding since 2007 to Gary Thorne. You see him here, who graduated from Georgetown Law School. Found, to his enormous credit, the law dull compared to broadcasting, and found special joy in his two loves, baseball and hockey. Last year, he said of Gleyber Torres' home run onslaught against the Birds, it's indescribable to me. We know how he felt. Let me end on two personal notes, if you would. One is Joe Angel, the fine radio voice, who worked here 19 years, braved that awful 1988 when the O's began the season 0-21. And as a bilingual Colombian, instead of English and Spanish, I can play it either way. Just tell me how to play it. His career ended in the win column, which was a phrase he often used, as did the grand Fred Manfred's, entering in the win column, who tied decency and ability, joined the O's from ABC Radio 1992, worked with boyhood idol Chuck Thompson, and called more Oriole games in history than anyone but him. Here's to Jeff Arnold, Mike Bordick, Kevin Brown, Tom Davis, Mike Flanagan, Scott Garceau, Buck Martinez, Ben McDonald, Melanie Newman, Jim Palmer, Brian Roberts, and Jim Hunter, who left the CBS Radio Game of the Week to join O's play-by-play and later studio. If I've missed anyone, truly my apology. Finally, how about former Orioles catcher and analyst Rick Dempsey, who once won fame for miming an inside-the-park home run as Babe Ruth on an infield tarp in a rain delay. Friends, if that's not Orioles broadcast magic, I don't know what is. Many thanks. Thank you for being here today, and I would welcome any questions if we have time that you would have.
Thank you very much, Curt. I do have a question. I have several questions that I'll relay from the audience. Neil Traven would like to know, when did the World Series go from competing club announcers to locals to doing an inning or two to only national network announcers?
Well, that's a very good question. And the year that happened really was 1966, which is a year O's fans recall fondly because it's the year of the four-game sweep of the Dodgers. That happened because NBC gained exclusivity that year. They paid a ton of money, and they were going to showcase their network announcer, Curt Gowdy, to full extent, which meant that Gowdy was going to broadcast every game. And he did that year, 4 games that year and 7 games the next year when it went 7 in 1967. That left, obviously, only half a game each game for the local team announcer. So what they did, for example, in 1966 at Dodger Stadium, the first two games, Curt Gowdy did half of each game and Vin Scully did half of each game. Then when the games 3 and 4 shifted to Memorial Stadium, Chuck Thompson did those 2 games, 4.5 innings each, and Curt Gowdy did the 4.5 as well. It's a good question, not simply factually, but emotionally as well, because the people that I have talked to over the years, given the choice, they would in a minute go back to the old days when you heard the local team announcers, because obviously, who knows the local teams better than the people that broadcast them each day?
Robert Komorowski would like to know, did any of the O's broadcasters pull double duty as Colts broadcasters?
Well, Chuck Thompson. He broadcast the Colts really from their not inception, I don't think. They were the Dallas Texans before they came to Baltimore, if memory serves. But he did broadcast in 1958 and 1959 their NFL championship game. They brought over the New York Giants, sadly, in 1959, and then over the Giants the year before in 58, the so-called greatest game ever played. There are those who will tell you they believe Chuck Thompson may have been an even better football broadcaster than baseball voice, if that's indeed possible. All I know is that, again, John Miller's marvelous aphorism, and that is, I don't care what Chuck says, as long as Chuck says it, is about as telling a definition as I have ever heard. So he is the one. There have been others. Bill O'Donnell did, I believe, as well. But of course, that too, in the 60s became really a network proposition, and local team broadcasters did not have the prominence that they did before.
A question from Jody Madron, who wonders, with Murphy, Harwell, Carneal, Thompson, and Miller, the O's had 5 eventual Ford Frick Award winners broadcast their games. How many teams have had more?
Well, the Yankees do. I know that's not the answer you want, but the Yankees have, I think, 10 or 11. But of course, you know, they have had, or used to at least, have winning teams year after year, which meant they got in the World Series year after year, which meant that their broadcasters could be in the Oktoberfest year after year, and therefore gain national prominence. But I'm talking about broadcasters like Mel Allen, who to me had the greatest voice in broadcast history, Red Barber, Phil Rizzuto, if you would, and others, Arch McDonald, who was the first voice of the New York Yankees. But 5 for the Orioles is a very, very high number. And the Ford C. Frick Award is the award that is given to the baseball broadcaster for broadcast excellence each year, awarded by the Hall of Fame, awarded by the committee of which I'm very proud to be a member. And it's funny because I talk to broadcasters in football and basketball and hockey, and they will tell you, off the record, of course, but that they think that the Ford C. Frick Award is the most prominent, the most eminent of any of the 4 sports, because they think that baseball broadcasting is the most elevated craft. They think baseball is the most difficult to do well. And I would tend to agree.
I have a question from Steve Ferencik. I'm going to take 2 more questions since we're running out of time.
Sure.
Did Brooks or Cal ever spend any time in the booth ever as guests? And did the O's ever try and bring them in as color analysts?
Well, Brooks Robinson did serve a number of years with Chuck Thompson as his color analyst. And Cal Ripken has done, or did at least, do broadcast for ESPN, and may have done some for Fox too as well. Although I don't know that he did color for the Orioles. He may have, but it escapes me. But no, Brooks did color analysts with Chuck Thompson for a number of years.
And I have a question from Dennis. Curt, do you have any information as to the events that led to the dispute in 1954 regarding the reconstruction of Memorial Stadium?
Well, it was put together on a night's watch, because the Browns were rather late in deciding that they were leaving St. Louis and going to Baltimore. They almost went to Los Angeles within the preceding 2 years, and almost went to Los Angeles. In 1941, had not Pearl Harbor intervened, the St. Louis Browns would have been the Los Angeles Dodgers, or the Los Angeles Browns, I guess. But Memorial Stadium had been a municipal stadium. It had been a Babe Ruth stadium, and it became the home of the minor league Orioles in 1944, when their prior wooden stadium burned down. So that when they got baseball in '54, Memorial Stadium won by default. And Memorial Stadium was a usable, productive ballpark, but it lacked the amenities, if you would. It did not have an idiosyncrasy to it, and really, it had in my view at least, had lasted out its stay. I think that it took Camden Yards, really, I think, to show a lot of us what we had been missing over the years. But having said that, there are people that grew up on the Orioles with Memorial Stadium, and still to this day, that stadium holds a great place in their heart, and deservedly so. Chuck Thompson for one, and Brooks Robinson for another.
Curt, I'm sorry to say that we have reached the end of our time. We're grateful for your presentation and for your wonderful slideshow.
Well, I'm grateful for all that you've done during this terrible pandemic this year, and how it's created so many complications for you folks. But you put together a marvelous virtual convention, and my thanks to you.
Okay, thank you, Curt.
Thank you.
Our next presenter is going to be Robert Fitz, who will be joining us momentarily.
I should be here.
Okay, are you there, Robert?
I believe so. Do you see me?
Okay, and Robert's name is well known to everyone in SABR. He has published 6 books on Japanese baseball. His latest is called Issei Baseball, the story of the first Japanese American ball players, and it's published this April by the University of Nebraska Press. And Robert will be speaking to us today. The title of his presentation is Scapegoat, How the First Japanese Professional Ball Player Was Framed as a Spy.
Good afternoon, everybody. So I have embedded my text into my slideshow. If everything works well, I will cover up my camera and I will see you for the question and answer period. John, I can only see you. So once I get started, if you can hear me okay and everything goes, please give me a thumbs up, okay? All right, so let's see about sharing the screen. Do you see only the title page and not my background of my computer? That's good. All right, let's see how this works. My Issei Baseball project started nearly 20 years ago with the purchase of this picture ticket on eBay. I had never heard of this team before. We okay, John?
We're good.
I reached out to Japanese American baseball expert Kerry Yo Nakagawa, and he provided me with a newspaper clipping showing that the ticket came from the 1911 Japanese Baseball Association, or JBBA. Realizing that nobody had examined early Japanese American baseball, I decided to investigate. Using online newspaper databases, I was able to reconstruct rosters and schedules. I found nearly 400 Japanese American games before World War I. Using genealogical databases, I was able to find out more about the players and their families. Through their children's obituaries, I was able to contact the families of 4 of the original players. These families provided me with photographs, letters, and stories. I also took a trip to Japan to meet family members and see the players' birthplaces. 5 years of research revealed stories about the beginnings of Japanese American baseball and the Japanese immigrant experience. Today, I will tell you the story of one of these early Japanese baseball pioneers. In May 1904, the Ueda family gathered in their garden. 18-year-old Tetsu Ueda put the final spade of soil around a camphor sapling. He had just graduated from Yamaguchi High School and was about to leave for California. 2 of his brothers, Junjiro and Takatomo, had plans to follow him. Tetsu gave a short speech. He had planted the sapling with 2 desires: that the family would remember them forever after they left, and that both they and the tree would have big futures. Born into the samurai class, the boy's father, Minoru, had the 2nd largest land holding in Yamaguchi Prefecture and served in the imperial diet. Following Japanese law and tradition, Minoru's eldest son would inherit the entire estate, and the younger brothers were expected to build their own lives. Minoru had wanted Tetsu to attend the military academy after high school, but Tetsu had other ideas. While attending Yamaguchi High School, the 3 middle Ueda brothers became avid baseball players. Tetsu was drawn to his English teacher, a young American named Raymond Peter Gorbald, who had played baseball for Cedarville College. Gorbald coached the baseball team and entertained his players with tales about the major league stars. Enamored by their stories, Tetsu decided to forego a career in the military and instead moved to the United States to become a professional baseball player. I caused a great commotion in my family by announcing that I was not going to the Army school, but to America, Tetsu recalled. After 6 months, I convinced my parents that nothing could change me, for in America, I had centered all my hope and ambition. Tetsu had intended to enroll at USC and play on the school's baseball team, but he found his English too weak to attend an American university. Instead, he got a day job in Los Angeles, studied English at night, and played amateur baseball on the weekends. Tetsu became renowned for his speed, winning the 200-yard dash at a 1905 festival held by Japanese immigrants in Los Angeles. Okay, that's not good.
At the time, America was enthralled by Japan and all things Japanese. Guy Green, the owner of the Nebraska Indians Baseball Club, decided to capitalize on the fad by creating an all-Japanese team to barnstorm across the Midwest. It would be the first professional Japanese team on either side of the Pacific. Although Green would claim that he had scoured the Japanese empire for the best players obtainable, he did nothing of the sort. In early 1906, Green instructed Dan Toby, the captain of the Nebraska Indians, to form a team from Japanese immigrants living in California. Among the players Toby recruited were Tetsu Ueda and his older brother Junjiro, who had just arrived in the U.S. Tetsu could barely believe his luck. His dream of becoming a professional ball player was about to come true. The players congregated in Lincoln, Nebraska in early April to practice. Green and Toby soon realized that many of their recruits were not skilled enough to play at the independent level. Green cut half of the Japanese from the roster and replaced them with Native Americans, probably hoping that most of the spectators would not be able to tell the difference. Throughout the season, the balance between fielding a competitive team and an all-Japanese lineup would be an issue. After practicing for 2 weeks, Green's Japanese baseball team embarked on a 25-week tour that covered over 2,500 miles through 9 Midwestern states. From April 15 to October 10th, the team played about 170 games against town teams and independent clubs. At the time, there were so few Japanese living in the Midwest that many rural farmers had never seen a Japanese person. So Green's advertisements emphasized the players' foreignness and the uniqueness of the team. A typical announcement read, "Green's team are the most novel baseball organization the world has ever known. Every player is a genuine Japanese. Not one of them can speak a word of English. They do all their coaching in Japanese, and it is certainly the most Japanesey Japanese you have ever listened to." Playing on the public's fascination with the Russo-Japanese War, Green also concocted fictional backgrounds for his players. For example, the shortstop Ken Kitsuse became a war hero wounded at the Battle of Mukden, and utility player Tozan Mosco became the nephew of the famous Admiral Togo. The advertising worked, and thousands came to watch the team play, sometimes traveling for a day by wagon just to reach the ballpark. Most of the spectators enjoyed the show, which often included a jiu-jitsu exhibition prior to the game. "The greatest event of the baseball season," proclaimed Illinois' Stark County News. In general, the team was well received by opposing teams, spectators, and the media. The racist cartoons and language so common at the time in California newspapers was nearly absent in the Midwestern papers covering the squad. The team did experience open bigotry at the ballpark at least once. According to the Des Moines Register, in a contentious game in Gardner, Iowa on September 3rd, the unruly crowd rushed into the diamond several times and called the Orientals harsh names. In the ninth inning, an argument broke out on the diamond, and a fan threw a baseball at Dan Toby, supposedly knocking him unconscious. A member of the Japanese team then threw the ball back into the crowd. After the game, the Gardner sheriff arrested this unidentified Japanese player and fined him $1. Despite the ruckus, the Hancock County Democrat declared it the best game of the season, noting, with the exception of the arrested player, the Japanese were all gentlemanly fellows and behaved nicely. The team did well on the field, winning 122 of the 142 games for which results are known. But at the end of the season, Green disbanded the club. In 1908, Tozan Mosco, Admiral Togo's supposed nephew, decided to form his own Japanese team in Denver and continue barnstorming. Anxious to continue his baseball career, Tetsu joined the club along with his younger brother, Takotomo. Mosco printed customized stationery. The letterhead announced in bold black ink, "Annual tour of Mikado's Japanese baseball team, direct from the schools and universities of Japan. The most marvelous team of genuine Japanese ball players on earth and the only one in America." The Denver Rocky Mountain News embraced the enterprise, noting, "With a team picked as this one is of the greatest players in Japan, a triumphal tour of America is expected." But the rival Denver Times, owned by William Randolph Hearst, who opposed Japanese immigration, was less supportive. In mid-April, the Mikado's season began with 3 games in Denver, before heading east through Kansas and into Missouri. They were not a strong club. The Mikado's defeated 2 small high school teams and some town teams, but were no match for the 2 colleges they played and were slaughtered by the African-American Lexington Tigers. In mid-May, it began to rain. It poured for weeks, flooding downtown Kansas City and baseball diamonds throughout the region. Unable to schedule games, the Mikado's abandoned the tour and returned to Denver after playing just 22 games. Tetsu would remain in Denver for several years, working for the Union Pacific Railroad and playing amateur ball. In 1912, Tetsu, now known as Tom, moved to St. Louis to work as a waiter at the St. Louis Country Club, the playground for the city's elite. Ambitious and smart, within 2 years, Tom became the club's head waiter. I was anxious to find out how I could best develop my personality, so I watched the guests at the club and patterned myself accordingly, for I too wanted to be cultured and considerate. He learned well and eventually became the club's manager, a surprising position at the time for a Japanese. In 1917, Tom defied convention by marrying Lulu Lamb, a 30-year-old American-born woman of Irish-English descent. At the time, Japanese white marriages were illegal in Missouri. To circumvent the law, Tom and Lulu married in Illinois on their way to their honeymoon in Chicago. The couple would remain happily married for almost 39 years, having a daughter named Vivian. By the mid-1930s, Tom had become a respected member of St. Louis society and the most successful of the city's 46 Japanese residents. He was managing director of the elite Bridle Spur Hunt Club with an annual salary of $4,000 and owned a luxurious $25,000 home. In the fall of 1937, the Japanese Board of Tourist Industry appointed Ueda as its honorary representative in Missouri to promote friendship between the two countries and to furnish information to those traveling to Japan. A few months later, Tom received an invitation to speak at a meeting of the Pacific Movement of the Eastern World on the conflict between Japan and China. Ueda balked, saying he knew little about the topic, but he could talk about the Japanese country, our history, our habits, and our customs. In February 1938, he addressed about 300 people, nearly all African Americans, at Pythian Hall in East St. Louis. I just told a few things about how our children are raised, our education, our culture, and our history. He returned home, probably thinking that it had been an uneventful, albeit unusual evening. Instead, the day would change his life. Tom did not know that the FBI had categorized the Pacific Movement as a dangerous insurgent group. Run by a Filipino con man posing as a Japanese named Ashima Takis, the group advocated the worldwide unification of non-white races under the leadership of Japan and was actively recruiting disenfranchised African Americans in East St. Louis. As the likelihood of war between the US and Japan grew, the FBI began gathering information on Japanese living in America. The Bureau made a list of community leaders, dubbing them suspect enemy aliens, without assessing these individuals' loyalty or their potential threat to the country. As the most visible and integrated Japanese man in the city, Ueda made a tempting target for the politically ambitious and overzealous U.S. Attorney Harry C. Blanton, who, as his obituary noted, was preeminently endowed with patriotic fervor and national pride. On the evening of December 7th, 1941, 3 FBI agents barged into the Bridle Spur Hunt Club and arrested Tom. Agents searched Ueda's home, confiscating Japanese language pamphlets and letters. Tom would spend almost 3 months in the city jail before facing charges. On February 26, 1942, at a closed-door hearing in the grand jury room on the 4th floor of the federal building, the Enemy Alien Hearing Board reviewed his case. Ueda was not allowed to have an attorney present. In the heart-wrenching transcript that I retrieved from Ueda's previously classified FBI file, Tom protests his innocence as Blanton claims that his speech at the Pacific Movement meeting and routine correspondence with the Japanese consul in Chicago were proof that Ueda was either an active Japanese agent or was in the position to aid his former country. Blanton offered no concrete evidence. According to the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, numerous patrons of the Hunt Club intervened on Ueda's behalf, but Blanton and the enemy alien hearing board disregarded all pleas. After just a few hours, the board sentenced Ueda to prison as an enemy of the state. While Ueda was incarcerated and unable to testify, he became a scapegoat during the trial of the members of the Pacific Movement. Before a grand jury on September 22, 1942, Blanton contended that Ueda had helped create a fifth column of armed African Americans to aid in a Japanese invasion of the United States. There was, of course, no evidence that Ueda was involved in the Pacific Movement. During his 3 years in captivity, federal officials attempted to parole Ueda, but each time Blanton blocked Tom's early release. The U.S. government finally released Tom Ueda in December 1945. Despite his unjust incarceration, Tom proclaimed, "I can honestly say that I have always been loyal to this country, and my love for this country shall remain the same until my death." In 1954, he became an American citizen and returned to managing clubs and restaurants before dying from a heart attack in 1956. He did not live to see his daughter Vivian marry the great-grandson of Adolphus Busch, co-founder of the Anheuser-Busch Brewery. I would like to tell you that Harry C. Blanton paid for his purposeful miscarriage of justice, but he did not. Instead, he was hailed as a defender of the country. But some understood his true nature.
Okay, thank you very much for listening. And I hope if you want to learn more about the early history of Japanese American baseball, you'll check out my book here, Issei Baseball, just published by University of Nebraska Press. And I'm more than happy to answer questions.
Well, thank you, Rob. And I do have a question for you from James McElwitz, who asks, one article cited Green's Indians team. Did the Indian team barnstorm with the Japanese team and play each other?
No, they did not. The Indians team went off to the East Coast while the Japanese team stayed in the Midwest.
Okay, I would welcome any other questions that you might have, and you can type them into the chat window. Several people were saying that the presentation was fascinating and was a fabulous presentation. Great visuals, great research, says David Littman.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Rob? Any stories about any of the other Greens players?
Oh, there's plenty of stories, but we can't do that in 5 minutes. The team, after they broke up, half the team went back to Los Angeles and formed their own first amateur team and then another professional team that barnstormed across the Midwest in 1911. And then eventually they went their separate ways and helped spread Japanese American baseball throughout the West Coast.
I have a question from Mark Armour. Did any of the Issei players play ball in the camps?
By the time the camps came along, they were all too old to play ball. It's likely that many of them coached the teams. Most of the players on this team that remained in the United States were put in the camps and stayed there until about 1944, where they managed to get early releases.
I have a question from Perry Barber. Did Tom ever go back and see his family in Japan?
Great question. Yes, he did. In the 1920s, he went back, saw his father just before his father passed away. And that was one of the pieces of evidence that Blanton used during the hearing to claim that he was a spy.
I have a question from Irv Goldfarb, who says, Robert, your knowledge of the subject is always outstanding, but are you sure in your own mind that your subject was innocent of spying?
I'm 100% sure, because I was able to retrieve the FBI file, which is about 400 pages long, and go through it closely, and there's no evidence at all. The evidence that was in Japanese that well, supposed evidence was just routine correspondence. So I can find nothing that suggests he was a spy, and his entire behavior before and after suggests that he was not, and had no close ties to Japan politically.
A question from George Robinson. Did the Japanese players face an equivalent of the racist treatment that afflicted African Americans under Jim Crow laws?
Not as much, but at times, yes. The bigotry towards the Japanese seemed to be worse in the West Coast than they were in the Midwest.
A question from Meredith Sandler. Were other of the players jailed during World War II? Were other Japanese in St. Louis interned?
Ueda was the only person actually put in jail. Some of the other players were interned in the camps because they lived in California. And in St. Louis, Ueda was the only Japanese American to be either put in jail or interred.
A question from Keith. Do you know of his interest in Japanese teams that toured the U.S. like Dia Nippon and Waseda in the 1930s?
Do I know of them, or did Ueda?
I'm not sure.
Yeah, I know something about them, and I'd be happy to talk to you about it someday. Ueda was involved in the early Japanese baseball, but not in any Japanese baseball after about 1915.
Did the green Japanese team ever play in Japan or other countries? Asks Michael.
No, once they broke up in 1906, they went their separate ways, but some of the players did go to Japan. Several of the players, including Kitsuse, the shortstop that I showed a picture of, joined the Seattle team that went over in 1914, and they were the first American-Japanese team to go to Japan.
Gilbert Martinez would like to know, did any MLB team consider any of these players, or did the race barrier bar them too?
None. That's actually a complicated question. None of these players were looked at seriously by MLB teams. There are a few news articles coming out in the early 20th century that suggest some Japanese immigrant players may have had tryouts, but we have no evidence that the tryouts actually occurred or that they ever had strong interest in signing them.
We're reaching our last few minutes, so I'll ask a couple of more questions. Neil Traven wanted to know, was Japan and the Allies during World War I? Did any of the players do military service?
Japan was our ally during World War I, but none of these players did military service, no. A number of their sons, however, fought in the Nisei Regiment during World War II.
I have a question asking if there are any lessons from this story for today to take away.
Absolutely. My entire book, Issei Baseball, is not only a baseball book, but it's also about the Japanese immigrant experience, the bigotry they faced. And I think a lot of the lessons about bigotry towards immigrants that we are dealing with today, it serves as a model for what other people have gone through.
I have a question from Stan Okenka, who wanted to know, what was the level of their play? Would you call it Class D, C, or A ball?
Honestly, I would probably say Class D. None of these players went and signed minor league contracts, even though they were pretty good in the Japanese American leagues.
Steve Ferencik wanted to know, has anyone ever created baseball cards of these players?
I have. You can find them on my website, robfitz.com.
Meredith Sandler wants to know, how did you get interested in this in the first place?
It started from that card that I showed in the very beginning that I got in eBay. And once I just found a story that nobody else had written about, I became intrigued. It took me almost 15 years to finally get around to it. And it took me 5 years of research until I had a finished product.
Final question. Perry Barber wanted to know if you could tell us about your amazing baseball player card collection, briefly.
Briefly, I've been collecting Japanese baseball cards since 1994, since I lived in Tokyo. I'm an otaku, which means complete geek in Japanese. And so I have many, many thousands of them, and I buy and sell them to this day.
Rob, we are grateful for your time. If anyone wants to reach out to you offline, may they do so?
Absolutely. Happy to talk Japanese baseball with anybody.
Okay. Thank you so much for your presentation.
Thanks so much.
Okay, we're going to shift over to Alan Cohen, and Alan has written a large number of almost 60 biographies for SABR's Bio Project, and has written extensively also for SABR's Games Project as well. And Alan, the floor is yours.
Okay, let me see what happens when I share the screen here, if I can. There we go. I believe we have it shared on there now. Does everybody see it?
Nope.
Is it on?
It is on.
Okay. Okay, we're going to be talking about Baltimore's Forgotten Dynasty, the 1919 to 1925 Baltimore Orioles of the International League. This is Jack Dunn's dynasty. You all have heard of Jack Dunn. This is a picture of him from 1921. In 1921, the Tip Top Bread Company had pictures of about 21 of the Baltimore Orioles, 20 players and their manager, and they put these pictures in loaves of bread so you could collect these cards. And several of the pictures I'm going to be showing are of from that set. This team won 3 Junior World Series, 20, 22, and 25. And in each of these years, they won at least 100 games a year. They had 2 long winning streaks, 25 games in 1920 and 27 games in 1921. One thing that enabled Dunn to keep going here is that the International League was exempted from the draft. So they couldn't draft the players on Dunn's team. This was an part of the settlement with after the Federal League went out of business. Dunn managed through 1928 and died suddenly of a heart attack on October 22nd, 28 in 1950 at age 56. And 11 of his players are in the International League Hall of Fame. Only one, however, is in Cooperstown. The turning point here, I'd like to talk about 1914 for a second. Jack Dunn is in his 8th year with the Orioles at the time, 5th as owner. He took over as owner in 1910, and he signed Babe Ruth. The Federal League Terrapins invaded Baltimore and frankly took the business away from the Orioles. Now, on July 9th, they sold Ruth, as well as pitcher Eddie Shore and catcher Ben Egan to the Red Sox. Combined price estimated at $25,000, and that might be overstated. They were competitive on the field as late as August 14th, but downhill the rest of the season. They lost 33 of their last 41 games, saying, what if they could have kept those players? They might have won. The last opening at Oriole Park was on August 22nd. They only had 1,200 people. The balance of the season was played on the road. Much of the games were scheduled on the road to begin with, but neutral sites were used for the remainder of the games. Many games were held in Wilmington, Delaware, and the Orioles did not field a team in 1915. Excuse me while I go to the next slide. Here are the Junior World Series results. As you can see, they won in 1920, 4-2 over the St. Paul Saints. In 22, they won in 7 games again against St. Paul. And in 1925, they won in 8 games against Louisville. The 1921 team lost that World Series, but they were rated the number 2 of the minor league teams of the 20th century in the study done by Weiss and Wright. They just did not win the World Series. In 1919, there was a Junior World Series, but it was held between the winners of the American Association and Pacific Coast League pennants. Starting in 1920 and basically going through 1975, the Junior World Series was held between the winners of the American Association and the International League. But this was Baltimore, this was their greatest period. After this, they only appeared in the Junior World Series in 1944. These are the 12 Orioles in the International League Hall of Fame and date of induction. The International League Hall of Fame had inductions every year from 1947 or 48 through 1963. Then they stopped with the inductions up until about 2007. That is why you have the big gap between 63 and 2008 for Oriole players. And the only one at Cooperstown, of course, is Lefty Grove. The Orioles were resurrected 1916 to 1918 after the fall of the Federal League. They renamed the park Terrapin Park Oriole Park. That was Oriole Park number 5 for those counting. We were supposed to go to Oriole Park number 6, but somehow that didn't happen. Maybe next year. Jack Dunn began to acquire the talent, and these guys wouldn't be sold. He was going to ask for high prices. The first key acquisition is Jack Bentley. Jack Bentley I discovered years ago when doing research on players who homered in the ballpark, Oriole Park. He came to Baltimore from Minneapolis to the American Association. He had started his career as a pitcher with the Washington Senators, but got sent down to the minor leagues. He just wasn't that good a pitcher. His mark was only 8-6 with a 4.15 ERA in 1916, but he batted 24 for 78 with Minneapolis and was often used as a pinch hitter with them. In 1917, Bentley was .343 with Baltimore. He appeared in only one game as a pitcher, and the Orioles improved to 88-61, third place behind, 2.5 games behind the league leaders. In 1918, the Orioles added Otis Lowry and Max Bishop and were in third place. This is the lineup in 1919, pretty much the everyday lineup and the everyday order. And this lineup, Jack Dunn put out on the field pretty much every day for a number of years. Look at the years that these guys played for the Orioles. A minimum of 6 years for each of these stars that I have highlighted in yellow. Mizell, Laurie, Jacobson, Bentley, of course, Bishop, and Joe Boley. So let's go to the lineup. We'll save the pitchers to later. Fritz Meisel was a player for the Orioles for 13 seasons, 1911 to 13, and then 1919 to 1928. He was in the majors from 1914 through 1918, and he led the American League in stolen bases with 74 in 1914 while playing with the New York Yankees. In his 1,684 games over 13 seasons with the Orioles, he batted .306. In their pennant-winning 7 years, his batting average was .319. And the third baseman was one of 2 players to play for the Orioles through the entirety of their dynasty. And after his playing days, he managed the Orioles from 1929 to 1932. The next player in the lineup number 2 in the lineup, Otis Laurie. He came to the Orioles late in the 1917 season and batted .396 in 20 games. He played infield and outfield for 8 seasons and batted .327 over that period of time. He led the league in batting with a .364 average in 1919. And in 1921, he was batting .352 until he got beaned in the 132nd game he played that year, and he was out for the year. In 1924, he got off to a terrible start. He was batting around 200. He raised his average to 238 in the last week he was with the team, but he was traded after the games on June 11th, 1924. He had had a very brief big league career with the Philadelphia Athletics, appearing in 71 games. And it's good to note here that he was one of many players who played with both the Philadelphia Athletics and the Baltimore Orioles. There was a very good relationship between Jack Dunn and Connie Mack. The center fielder, Merwin Jacobson, he was acquired by the Cubs prior to the 1918 season, and he was in war-related work in D.C. in 1918, debuted with the Orioles in 1919. He was 6 seasons with the Orioles, batting .341, and he was traded to Jersey City prior to the 1925 season. He led the International League in batting with a .404 average in 1920, a record that lasted all of 1 year. But when he finally got to the big leagues with the Brooklyn Dodgers in 1926, they were the Robbins back then, he batted .247 in 110 games. The next player, we see him pitching, is Jack Bentley. He's a hitter who could pitch or a pitcher who could hit. I'm not too sure which, but he played both plays. He was in World War I. He had a situation up in 1918. He was drafted by the Boston Red Sox. So he had his choice. Does he go to the Boston Red Sox or does he go to Europe and fight in France? He decided to go to Europe and fight in France. Nothing against my Red Sox friends. He rejoined the Orioles in 1919. The season was already underway. He batted .324 with 45 extra base hits in 92 games. He did not appear as a pitcher in 1919. He went back to pitching in 1920. 1921 was his Triple Crown year, the first Triple Crown winner in the International League. He batted .412. He set a league record, which was later broken, with 24 homers, and he had 120 RBIs. He led the league with 47 doubles. He went 12-1 as a pitcher with a .234 ERA. He had 20 or more homers in 3 consecutive seasons, and in those 3 seasons, he went 41-6 as a pitcher. He went to the Giants in 1923, where he was used as a pitcher. They didn't need a first baseman. They had Kelly going out and Terry coming in, so he pitched his entire time with the Giants. He was 40-22 with them in 3 years. He batted .329 with 4 homers, and his batting average in 1923, his first year with the Giants, was over .400, and he did very well as a pinch hitter. He was close to .500 batting average as a pinch hitter. Now, the next slide, we're going to go out of sequence here and out of the lineup because I want to tell this story. This is Babe Ruth, Jack Dunn, and Jack Bentley. This picture was taken October 3, 1923. And if you look carefully, you will see that both players are wearing uniforms of the New York Giants. And you might wonder why. Well, they played, the Giants did, the Baltimore Orioles on that date. And the game was held as a fundraiser for John B. Day and Jim Mutry, both of whom were destitute by that time. They had founded the original New York Metropolitans in 1880 and staged the first game at the original Polo Grounds in September of that year. The Giants won the game 9-3 with 3 Yankees in the lineup. 8 of the Giants who played that day wound up in the Hall of Fame, as did their manager, as did their manager, John McMurray. In the game, Ruth batted against the starting pitcher for the Orioles, Lefty Grove. He struck out in his first appearance, and Grove hit him with a pitch in his second time up. Ruth, in the 5th inning, homered against Jack Ogden, arguably the best pitcher with the Orioles, and the ball cleared the right field roof. Ruth became the first hitter to hit a ball over the right field roof at the Polo Grounds, since he had done it the prior season when he played all his home games at the Polo Grounds. 1923 was the first year the Yankees played at Yankee Stadium. Casey Stengel tripled in the game, and the Giants had 4 homers in all that day. I find it ironic that Casey Stengel, who managed the 1962 Metropolitans, played in a benefit for the founders of the 1880 Metropolitans. Now back to the lineup and the shortstop, Joe Boley, also a player who played all the years of the dynasty. He was with the Orioles from 1919 to 1926. His home run won the decisive Game 6 of the 1920 Junior World Series, and he batted .313 in his 8 seasons with the Orioles. His home run high was 1926. His last year with the team, he had 19. And like so many of the Orioles, he was there a long time. It wasn't until age 30 that he finally got to the majors with the Philadelphia Athletics and batted .311 in his rookie season. Max Bishop was the second baseman. He was the young-looking fellow. He was with the Orioles from 1918 to 1923, and he batted .284. His best year with the Orioles, his last season, was .333 in 1923, and he also went to the Philadelphia Athletics. He also played with the Boston Red Sox. This is the Baltimore Orioles team from 1919, the first pennant winner team. They went 149. That was the worst record of any of the pennant-winning teams. This is the Orioles from 1920, 110-43 they went. And if you look at the front row, you see, third in from the left, a guy who looks a little smaller than the rest of the team. Well, this guy's name is Paul Schmidt. And we'll talk about him in a second. There's Paul Schmidt. He didn't get the memo for the other team photo. There he is in plain clothes. The 1920 Baltimore Orioles won their last 25 games, and they edged Toronto by 2.5 games in the standings. And they won the Junior World Series, and as I said before, it was the first of 3. What is your success without a mascot? This is Paul Schmidt. This is the article. This is the lead article in the March 14th, 1921 issue of the Baltimore Sun. Smitty, the mascot, had signed his contract to come back for another year. And they had honored him the prior year at a dinner that was held after the season for the Orioles. Unfortunately, I have not been able to find out much more about Paul Schmidt other than that he was the mascot for the Orioles. Now it's time for the pitchers. And we are talking about an abundance of arms here. Rube Parham from 1917 through 2022 to 24 and 26. We'll talk about him more, but there were gaps here because he was in and out of the doghouse with Jack Dunn. Harry Frank, 1919 to 1924. Jack Ogden, 20 to 27, and so forth, on to Jack Bentley. The ups and downs of Rube Parham. You just tell me when my time is up, please, and we'll take questions at that point. In parts of 8 seasons with the Orioles, Parham went 139 and 60. He went 16 and 9 with the Orioles in 1917, was 28 and 12 on the first pennant winner in 1919, and but then in 1920 he was 5 and 0. He was said to be out of shape. In 1924 he was 6 and 5, and he was fined by Dunn for being AWOL. Again, a very brief career in the major leagues, just 2 years. Harry Frank never made it to the big leagues. He played semi-pro ball in the Baltimore area for a couple of years. He first pitched with the Orioles in 1919, going 24 and 6 with them. And he won 3 of 20 or more games on 3 occasions in his 5 seasons with the Orioles. Jack Ogden, too long with the Orioles. He went 191 and 80 with the Orioles in 8 years, from 1920 to 1927. Led the International League with wins 4 times. But he finally made it to the majors again at age 30. With the Browns, he went 15 and 16, only 25 and 34 in his years in the majors. The Hall of Famer, Robert Moses Grove, won 300 major league games. It should have been more. He was 108 and 36 in 5 seasons with the Orioles. He won 25 or more games 3 times, but Dunn would not sell him until he got his $100,000. And in his time with the Orioles, Grove struck out 1,000 batters, more than 1,000 batters. Tommy Thomas was 32 and 12 in 1925, had a pretty good big league career in 12 seasons. He was 117 and 12 and won 19 games in 1927. And he went on to manage the Orioles after his career. Dick Porter joined the team with his bat in 1921, was with the Cleveland Indians in 1929 and batted 300 in his first 4 big league seasons. He led the International League in batting with a .363 average in 1924. 1921, 27 games in a row the Orioles won, and the mascots, they had 2 that year. You see both kids, Paul Schmidt and Johnny Jones, blamed each other for the defeat and almost came to fisticuffs when the streak ended. And their record, they had tied a record that was set by a Texas League team in Corsicana in 1902. That record of 27 in a row was not broken until 1987, when the Salt Lake Trappers won 29 in a row. The 22 Baltimore Orioles. Look at these pitchers, how they could hit. Bentley was playing every day. He had 22 homers. Jack Ogden, 24-10, batted .220 with a pair of homers. Tommy Thomas had a pair of homers. Parham had 14 extra base hits, 6 homers, and a .315 batting average. Grove had a pair of doubles, and even Frank, who couldn't hit for average, had a home run. Jimmy Walsh came to the Orioles in the twilight of his career. He had played with them in 1910 through 12. In 1922, he played the outfield and batted .327. The following year, he batted .333, playing first base. And he was in professional ball until 1931. Fabulous career. You never have enough pitching, so they brought on Chief Bender in 1923, and he was 6 and 3. He had played with the Federal League Terrapins in 1915. Jack Dunn. The team acquired Clayton Sheedy, and this is a tragedy. This was the top college player in the country. He could have signed for any number of major league teams. He signed for the Orioles. Dunn kept him there for a number of years. He never made it to the majors, batted .325. He went to the Red Sox as a scout from 1949 through 1967. He's the 1923 Orioles. In the 1924 Orioles, they brought on George Earnshaw as a pitcher. In 1925, Earnshaw went 29-11, and they won their 7th consecutive pennant. He went to the A's in 1928 and won 20 games in each of his first 3 big league seasons, and had a big league record of 127-93. Those are the 24 Orioles, 117-48. The 25 Orioles in their last hurrah, they didn't have Grove, but 3 guys on the staff won at least 28 games. Ogden won 28, Earnshaw won 29, and the team leader was Tommy Thomas with 1932. The team's batting average was .301. It was second in the league to Toronto, and their 188 homers were tops in the league. And in the Junior World Series, they defeated Louisville in 8 games. And that is the picture of the team. And that is my presentation. So I guess now I'll take any questions if you want to ask them.
Alan, I have several for you. The first question comes from Stephen. How did Dunn end up with the minor league Orioles? Why did the International League stop inducting players into its Hall of Fame and resumed it decades later?
Okay, as far as Dunn is concerned, Dunn started his career as a pitcher, and then he went to the Orioles as a player. Manager in 1907. He had been with Providence, led them to the pennant in 1905. So he went to the Orioles, and in 1910 he bought the team. As far as the Hall of Fame is concerned, there's not a physical International League Hall of Fame. So they just had a trophy. They walked around to ballparks, and there was a lack of interest at a certain point, and then they resurrected it, is all I could say.
I have a question from Rick. Any reason why the format was changed for the 1919 season?
Oh, in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, the Junior World Series was not held every year. It was held maybe 5 or 6 times under various formats. So in 1920 was the first year they went to International League versus American Association. It seemed to work, and they continued on with that format. The Pacific Coast League was, especially in its later years, they considered themselves out there as like a 3rd major league at times, and some of their teams probably could have competed with the big league. So, and they had open status for a while. So AAA, if not for no other reason, traveling reasons, they decided to go with the American Association versus International League in the Junior World Series.
Were the Orioles paid as well or better than major leaguers during this period?
They weren't paid as much, but they were paid well. The story about Jack Bentley was each time he hit a home run, there was a local tailor, clothier, who gave him a suit. So he wound up being the best dressed man in Baltimore when he had something like 20 home runs in a season. So the players were treated well there, but still I'm quite sure they would have liked the opportunity to play in the big leagues.
You mentioned the reserve clause in connection with the IL's exemption from the draft and the abuses of that. Besides Grove, which of those players do you think got screwed by that and missed years in the majors that they deserved?
I'd say the whole lineup. The whole lineup. I would say Max Bishop could have made it. The Clayton Sheedy was probably the worst example. This was a kid who the Washington Senators wanted to sign out of college. He was at Georgetown. He was the #1 player in the country, but Dunn got in there. So Sheedy's the worst example.
We're running out of time, so I'll ask 2 last questions. David Hauser asked, we hear a lot about the great pandemic. Did that pandemic have any impact on those leagues or these players?
Not a major one. I did not do much research into the pandemic. It did affect Baltimore. It did affect the start, of course, of the 1919 season, which got delayed. 1918, you had not only the pandemic, but you had the war, World War I, which shortened the season in 1918 as well. So by the time we're talking about the championship run, the impact of the pandemic was not as big in 1919 as it had been in 1918.
I have a question from Herb. Do the season records include postseason wins and losses? Was there a standard length of the season in the International League during those seasons?
There wasn't. The season was of various lengths, but usually it was about 150 games.
Well, thank you so much, Alan, for your great job. And if people would like to learn more about this, can they reach out to you?
Absolutely. And some people know my pet project if they want to write to me about that as well.
Thank you so much, Alan. We are going to move to our 4th and final presentation of the day. We are now joined by a person who has Spalding in his name, Keith Spalding Robbins, who's going to present on Baltimore, Berlin, and the Babe, the 1936 Olympic baseball team. Keith has been a SABR member since 2013. His family's baseball story is an open book for all, especially if you read John Thorne, Peter Levine, or Mark Lamster. He was named after his father's uncle, whose namesake building catches its fair share of home runs hit at Caltech. Keith has been published in the 2013 to 2014 Cooperstown Symposium and 9, and his research interests include old-timers games and international baseball tours. Keith, welcome.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me all right?
I sure can.
Good deal. Why don't we get started here? The whole premise of this is looking at baseball as a moral endeavor. And what I found really interesting was this 1936 baseball team started in Baltimore with the intent of playing in Berlin. And of all people, Babe Ruth was associated with this team for a couple months. And you could say that the Babe's purpose in this team was to drive the baseball bus to Berlin, and along the way, someone stole Babe's keys. The photo on the left here is when the team arrived in Berlin in late August or late July 1936. One of the players noted that they were completely unaware of the state of affairs in Germany, and they were utterly surprised by how many people were wearing uniforms. And one of the teenagers on the team said, "We first thought they were honoring us," not really knowing the true intent of what was going on in Nazi Germany at the time. So our story really starts with international baseball politics with the International Olympic Committee. And one of the fascinating things is the International Olympic Committee banned Germany from 2 Olympics in the 20s, realized differently, awarded Berlin the Olympic Games 2 years before Hitler comes into power in 31. And then by 1934, as the politics were getting very severe, they offered US a bait, and that was the US was allowed to and offered to play baseball in the 1936 Olympics perhaps as an incentive for the U.S. not to boycott the games themselves. The other key issue here is that Germany was not allowed to either have an air force or build airplane engines, and we'll see how that comes into play later on. As part of that 1934 mission to bring baseball to the Olympics, the 1935 Wheaties All-Americans were a test run team. It was picked by the U.S. Olympic Committee and featured some pretty good ball players. And they played in Japan for 2.5 months, winning most of the games rather easily. One game actually was a volcano delay, the first game they played, while another player noticed that the Japanese players were pretty good players. Interesting enough, it wasn't very well received by Japan itself, and the whole idea of the Wheaties team sponsoring this amateur team and putting their name on the uniforms probably didn't sit well with the Japanese. The names in blue were actually the players that made the Olympic team the next year. Back home, as we know, the politics in 1935 and 36 regarding the Olympics were just as debated and keenly of keen interest to many different people. What we'd say here is that while the Wheaties All-Americans were on the boat back from Japan, Team Japan actually pulled out of their baseball game. At the same time, MLB had its winter meetings. And in a switch with regard to the baseball a couple years earlier, they didn't give Les Mann and his USA amateur team any money whatsoever. And then in turn, they also banned any barnstorming to Japan and other countries during that time period. So when we turn to the Olympics themselves, next couple of pages are straight from the official Olympic report. It's pretty clear that these games were deceptions of something bigger. And one of the most fascinating propaganda posters I found here is the Zeppelin, which instead of bombing London during World War I, is now flying an Olympic flag over the Olympic Stadium. And then this quote from in the Olympic report noted that Europe is too small for war and the Germans are a peaceful people, which we know really wasn't true. And the propaganda myth goes on even further, and this is page 6 of the Olympic report, in which it says the competition awakes the best qualities and unites all nations. And I guess my question for you, anyone, is who do you think is attributed to this? And the answer is none other than Adolf Hitler. So we can see what's really going on here with the Olympic endeavor. The key issue here with the Olympics is what we call demonstration sports. And while the Olympics were known as an amateur endeavor, the demonstration sports were given to the host country to demonstrate two great sports that symbolic of the country's culture and identity. Unlike other Olympic Games, in 1936, one game was given to Germany, one sport called gliding, and the other sport, of all things, was given to the United States, and another sport which was totally unknown in Germany, but we refer to it as baseball, which of course we're all familiar with. When we look at gliding, one of the really fascinating things is all the participants here were within the specter or the realm of German influence or prospective German influence before the war. It was sponsored by the Luftwaffe and Luftwaffe Command. It was held in Air Force bases. And the winner was actually a Swiss, but all the other medal winners were German. And so that was really an essence of the reason why I was gliding and not anything else is because Germany was still under the ban of producing airplane engines. And this really was fighter pilot training for the Luftwaffe in the years before the war. To that specter, we have baseball. And part of the whole issue is how to create a national team and national interest for amateur baseball. And Les Mann, who ran the team at the time, turned to none other than Babe Ruth to be, of all things, and as the ads say, the commander-in-chief of U.S. Olympic baseball. This is an ad from the Sporting News in April, in which you were to fill out the application blank and attend one of the trials. Indeed, the Babe was quoted extensively in spring training in Florida as taking a great interest in amateur baseball and actually going to Berlin with the team as late as the middle of March. By the time the season started, the Babe's position had changed. I think Major League Baseball got a hold of the Babe through different sources, and the Babe disappears from the Olympic movement altogether. And we know the date was actually April 12th, a couple days before the season started, when Dinty Dennis, who was a sports writer in Miami and part of the Olympic team as assistant coach, blasts Major League Baseball in an editorial in one of his columns, noting that the Olympic baseball team's an orphan. And the other picture here we see is the team was such an orphan, they didn't get to wear warm-up jackets. And so when the game got cold, they had to put blankets on themselves. Another key thing is that at this early time, they weren't sure who they're going to play, but a French baseball team that played in Tunis was put forth as their new opponent. The other issue which comes into play, which is really fascinating, is the same day in the Des Moines Register, we have two high school ball players. One is the name of Bob Feller. You might have heard of him. And another one from another small town in Iowa was a kid named Grover Galvin Jr., who joined the Olympic team. And joining this Olympic team was quite an endeavor. After debate and some other issues, the city of Baltimore agreed to put up the team and to sponsor them. And after all, Babe Ruth promised to be there as well. The two catches were you had to prove that you're an amateur status. And number two, which was really a significant issue during the Depression, is this team was self-funded. So any player who wished to play on the team had to put up all the money themselves. And looking at it, just to put it, it cost each player about $1,000 to play in this Olympic team. And to put it in perspective, $1,000 in 1936 could buy you two brand new Ford V8s or a house. Consequently, there was a lot of limitations on the players that actually could afford to go. And where they went was, of all places, Mount St. Joseph School in Baltimore, that at the time, one of Babe Ruth's mentors, Brother Matthias, was a teacher at. And here's a nice view of the school itself in the field. And the school offered its dormitory and gymnasium for the players as practice facilities. The key here, though, is that Babe is nowhere to be found. And the promise that the Olympic team gave to the city of Baltimore was, if you put up the money, we'll give you 2 slots. Well, Baltimore responded with a great thud of apathy and raised a total of $7 in their benefit games. One of the benefit games with the police was actually a SABR game bio a couple years ago. But as a result, we see that Baltimore washed their hands in the endeavor, and they left Baltimore in kind of a thud with no great fanfare. And what about the Babe? Well, the Babe at this time was doing Babe Ruth things. And one of the most fascinating things is the Hall of Fame stops its Babe scrapbooks in 1935, the year he stops as a player. But newspaper.com has over 2,000 hits of what the Babe was doing during the week of July, first week of July, when the tryouts were in Baltimore. And the Babe was in Nova Scotia. And the Babe was in Nova Scotia doing Babe Ruth things, visiting hospitals, getting pictures with lobsters, going fishing. and just being the Babe Ruth celebrity. During the time of the Olympics themselves, Babe was out playing golf in upstate New York, trying to get away from it all. Ironically, Babe plays this really unique role as kind of the godfather of American sports. And while he's in New York, he attends the great send-off banquet and famously tells Jesse Owens that he will win. And actually, the long quote is actually from Jesse Owens' own website. Encourages the team in that sense. And then when the team returns in September, the Babe is also there. And at a banquet in which Mayor LaGuardia hands out the medal that's shown, the Babe is there handing out medals and kind of being the great godfather of sports, welcoming the champions back. So he has a distinct role in all this, but not the one that he probably anticipated. So when we actually get to the game itself, here's our team photo. It was taken at the Olympic Village in Berlin. The team was broken up into the Reds and the Blues. And if you look very carefully at the team on the right, they have a white hat and actually wearing red socks. And the team on the other side is wearing a blue and red hat and blue socks. And this subtle differentiation was totally lost on everybody at the game, but it's how we can tell the difference between the two teams. All but 2 players actually were selected, had direct connections with the coaching staff or the Pennsylvania Athletic Association. And we'll get into those. So it's clearly that not only were the teams self-funded to get there, but their own coaches picked them. So it's not really an all-American team as much as it is a selected team. And so here we have our 2 starting lineups. And for the sake of time, I'll just mention 3 players. On the red side, halfway down, Ike Livermore, the catcher, actually played baseball at Stanford, and the Stanford coach was the assistant coach of the team. But his last college baseball game was 3 years before that. He was captain of the Stanford team as well, and actually he was traveling through Europe at the time with his brother, and supposedly sent a letter back to his mother, said, "Please send me my spikes and glove." And on August 1st, walks into the U.S. Olympic camp and becomes the starting catcher for the team. The other player who's very interesting is actually on the blue side, named Ralph Carlston. He actually signs a contract with the 1932 Baltimore Orioles as an infielder, and then ends up in the winter attempting to play in the Canadian Football League for the Ottawa Rough Riders. After a couple games, everyone in Ottawa knows that they're up to something and this guy's too good. They find out that he'd played baseball in the US and he's actually kicked out of the Canadian Football League for being a professional. And yet, 4 years later, he's back as an amateur and playing in the Olympics. And then the final person I wanted to mention as a great curiosity is Curtis Myers, the right fielder who wore number 19. Turns out Curtis Myers played for Chief Bender at the Naval Academy in 1927 as his last recorded baseball game. He's mentioned as being a member of the Pennsylvania Athletic Club. He did not try out in Baltimore, and yet there's no record of him playing for the Pennsylvania Athletic Club. What we do have him is a record as Lieutenant Colonel Myers of the United States Navy, stationed in Philadelphia, and his areas of expertise are foreign languages and aviation. And so, for all accounts, we think he's the spy on the team as we go forward. This team, though, was completely part of the Olympic movement, the Olympic team, and considered full members of the Olympic team. And here we have Ike Livermore in his Olympic best, about ready to march into the stadium. And one of the sidelights of the trip was the second baseman of the team, Dow Wilson, was a very good card player. And he and Jesse Owens to make time in the 12-day sail trip to and from Europe, played a game of bridge in which they scored over 80,000 points. And as for the game itself and the stadium, we'll first start with the uniqueness of the venue. It was shoehorned into the Olympic Stadium. The game was played at 8 o'clock at night under the lights, but the lights were really designed for track and field and not for baseball. The field itself was actually described as a rhombus by the German media, not knowing what a baseball diamond was, and delineated with some plastic tape. The bases were cut out in the infield like AstroTurf style. The pitcher's mound was no mound, just a circle. And interesting enough, the orientation of the field was sort of Yankee Stadium-like, which Death Valley into left center and left field, all the way to the wall, past the track. And right field was nice and short. And interestingly enough, the Führer's box was 10 feet inside the line and well within hitting distance. And for that reason, we see that the Americans were told under no circumstances that they were hit the ball into right field. And of course, we know what Americans thought of that rule. This is one of the two photos of the game itself. This is the first at-bat in the first inning by Bill Shaw of the Olympic team and also Bowdoin College. He hits a line drive to left center, and by the time the fielders catch it, he's rounded the bases. And interesting enough, this is also Ike Livermore as the catcher. Interestingly enough, the game also ended on an inside the park home run by a guy named Les McNeese from Fort Lauderdale, Florida, which was written up. And Paul Amen, who's in the Nebraska Hall of Fame as a football player, and also in the baseball coaches, college coaches Hall of Fame as well, wrote in his diary that it was a great demonstration. And the team really were very proud of themselves for the effort that they had pulled off to get this game. However, the rest of the world didn't think so. And one of the real trouble they had was the translation of baseball into German, or if you will, baseball into being an Olympic sport. And so these are actual rules of baseball that I took from the Olympic report itself. So the batter on one side, shown here by Mighty Casey, is the batter is only allowed 3 trials. And should he fail to hit one of his 3 trials, he is out. And interestingly enough, the shortstop position was noted for having no definite position, but his main goal was to catch or stop weakly batted balls. So don't tell Ozzie Smith that, but that's how they thought of the shortstop. The American media had a hard time with this team as well. And one thing we see is a great flip-flop. Before the game, the media reporting was very positive and very upbeat, calling these teams, calling the players crack amateurs and looking for 800 to 700, 700 to 800 of the best ball amateur players to make this team. After the game, when they realized the Germans had no idea what they were watching or seeing, they're called obscure ball teams, and then go on to say that Germans were bored and baffled and thought baseball was terrible. Yet, despite all that, and through all this, the main person who ran the team and was the guiding light and force for the Olympics, Olympic baseball and amateur baseball before World War II, was Les Mann. And the Sporting News was very positive about him and noted that he really was a pioneer, and pioneers encounter everything but positiveness during the time period. But he really was the force in attempting to create international baseball and actually helped sponsor something called the Moores Cup, which was international baseball played up until 1942. Sadly, the U.S. never finished in the top 2 or 3 during that time period, though. And then I want to highlight 3 other players on the team, just to give you a sense of the sense of nationalism on the team. Wagner and Herringer were the battery for the Blues. Wagner was from Georgia, and Herringer was, of all things, from California. So you can imagine really a sense of the nationalism of the team. There was one Jewish player on the team. His name was Herb Goldberg. He was from Brooklyn, and we'll get back to him a little bit. He played left field, although he was the catcher during all the tryouts. And he's mistakenly issued as a catcher in an essay in the New York Times, I think last year. But he was left field just in this Olympic game. But during the game itself, the Germans called his name Harold Goldberg, spelled in German, on the scoreboard. So they did their best to kind of hide that. Interesting enough, Carson Thompson here became the team spokesman because he was the only one who spoke German. And interestingly enough, he gave interviews to, of all people, Eva Braun. And Eva interviewed the team and had cameras following them their entire time in Germany, saying that she was doing a documentary on them. Interesting enough, we found no evidence of this documentary at all. And if anything, the Germans were spying on the Americans in the same way maybe that Curtis Meyer was spying on the Germans. Interesting enough, also, the Spalding guy the year later noted one of the few positive press on the team, saying that they're a credit to our country and the national game itself. And that kind of leads us to the end of our little story here. The first thing is, what about the Babe? And in 1936, baseball didn't know what to do with the Babe at all. And in fact, one newspaper in the Minneapolis Star said, Babe was the old guy who sits alone on the bench, waiting for the call that never came. And indeed, baseball ignored the Babe completely in 1936. And it's not really until after the war when the Yankees realized that something had to be done. And as a result, the Yankees instituted Old Timers Day as kind of a remembrance of the Babe and a remembrance of all the former players of the Yankees. And a lot of other teams did that too during that time period. And of course, that's fallen by the wayside. On the Olympic side, interesting enough, the same paradox that existed in 1940 is still in existence today. And for those of you who are following it, we know that Team USA hasn't made the Olympics if they're going to be played next year. And to do that, they have to beat Cuba and the Dominican Republic and other teams. So it's interesting that now 80 years later, history is repeating itself with USA amateur baseball just not ready for prime time in any way. One of the most fascinating lessons in all this and legacy of the team was Herm Goldberg, who left a great deal of archives at the Hall of Fame and actually at the National Holocaust Museum National Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. He left us a legacy of what the game meant and what baseball is all about. So he tells us that baseball was what he learned to live with competition, which is a lesson baseball players need to know even today, whether you're an Astro or Pete Rose or anyone who's done some steroids. Also, he also tells us that there is no crying in baseball, especially when you lose. And to win in baseball, you should do that with joyousness. And most importantly, you should share that with your teammates. And this is just a fascinating photo that's from the Hall of Fame archives of Herm. He and sprinter Marty Glickman toured Berlin together during an off day. And what makes this picture so stunningly interesting is that we've got Nazi flags and Olympic flags in a scrubbed Berlin street. But of all things, he's standing in front of a storefront window display, and it is more Nazi propaganda where they took classical Greek mythology and merged it with their Olympic Games and created propaganda art for everyone. And of course, we know the 1936 Olympics was the first time the Olympic torch relay began too, also by the Nazis, filling in that issue of propaganda. and connection to classical Greece. And so finally, I wanted to leave you with one simple thing, and that is, what does Herb tell us to really share? And I think he wants to tell us about sharing baseball as an experience. And for all of you who have sat for the last 2 hours, if you wanted to do a little 7th inning stretch and join me, we can sing a little song that Harry Carey and others sing so much better than the rest of us. But it goes, take me out to the ball game. Take me out with the crowd. Buy me some peanuts and Cracker Jack. If I don't care, I'll never get back. Let me root for the home team. And if they don't win, it's a shame, for it's 1, 2, 3 strikes, you're out at the old ball game. So thank you very much.
Thank you so very much, Keith. We're nearing the end of our time, but I had some questions for you. I have one from Stephen, who asked, how well funded was the American baseball team compared to the other team they competed against at the 1936 games? Did any of the American players sign professional contracts after the Olympics?
The U.S. played each other. So it was a self-funded event. One player, Bill Sayers, had a record of 1-3 in the majors, and I think his one victory was with the Giants against the Braves, and he's the only one who made it to the majors of this team.
I have a question asking, was Les Mann the former outfielder of the 1914 Miracle Braves?
Yes, that's the same Les Mann. It turns out he had a very interesting career and run-ins with the commissioner. So he was on the permanently ineligible list when he tried to retire in the 20s. But then Major League Baseball gave him $10,000 to start an amateur baseball team in the 20s in the school. But then by the 36 Olympics, Major League Baseball doesn't give him anything. But that's Les Mann. He's quite a character.
Mark Cantor asked, was there any discrimination against minority or Jewish players? I assume that being self-funded affected minority participation.
I couldn't find any minorities who played on the team. So discrimination, yes. The real issue seemed to be self-funding. And I did read a lot of stories about some of the players who were quite good who couldn't make it because they couldn't raise the money. It's in the middle of the Depression, and they needed almost $1,000 to go. So that limitation really limited the pool.
I had a question. Sorry, I interrupted you there.
The other issue is a lot of the other Olympic sports were also self-funding in that time period. And that really altered who could go to the Olympics in 1936.
I have a question from David. Did they win the gold medal?
No, as a demonstration sport, there was no medal given. So the only medal the team won was actually a participation medal. And then the mayor of New York, Pierre LaGuardia, gave them all Olympic medals as well when they returned. That was when Babe was there giving them those awards in September.
Well, the last question that I have comes from Neil Traven, asking, what other nations had baseball teams in 1936? I assume Japan, maybe Cuba, and some Caribbean countries, but who else?
Believe it or not, England had a great deal of baseball. And actually, after the Olympics, they ended up playing 2 games in London, winning one and losing the other. Ironically, the best players in British baseball in that time were all Canadians. One of them, I think his name was Roland Gando or Glenn, who actually played for the Braves, I think, or the Dodgers in the 40s. But there were half a dozen countries that played baseball, and part of Les Mann's efforts were to create an association of amateur baseball that was global. But it was mainly Japan, Korea, Dominican Republic, Venezuela, Puerto Rico, and Curacao. So the same great baseball powerhouses that we know today were very much part of the baseball world in 1930s and 1940s.
Well, Keith, we have reached the end of our time and reached the end of our session. If as I've asked our other speakers, may people reach out to you offline if they have questions?
Absolutely. I'll look forward to talking to everyone, and especially Robert Fitz on more Japanese American baseball. So thank you. And also want to give a shout out to Chris Dial and the SABR chapter for suffering through a couple of dress rehearsals with us too.
Yes, thank you, Chris. And thank you all for attending SABR Virtual. Today's presentations will be posted online on SABR's YouTube channel afterward. If you want to go back and watch them again, you can find the complete schedule or register to attend our next virtual sessions on the website at sabr.org. Thank you again, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time. Good night.